Who doesn't love a good bedtime story to give you sweet, sweet nightmares? Now in movie form. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, movie review. Hey Twisted People, it's your Twisted Girl here, and today I am doing a movie review of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. The shadow of the Bellows family has loomed over the town of Mill Valley for decades. It's in a mansion that young Sarah Bellows turns her tortured life and secrets into a series of scary stories. Those tales become all too real for a group of unsuspecting teens who stumble into Sarah's home. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark has some truly horrifying moments and even some poignant real-world commentary. Yet, the movie occasionally suffers from very generic main characters and uneven plotting. Scares. What I really appreciated about this movie is that it didn't rely on jump scares. It was very much about building atmosphere when it came to talking and dealing with the monsters throughout. Because if you don't know, Scary Movies to Tell in the Dark is based off of a book series of scary stories to tell in the dark. And what the movie does when it comes to some of the very haunting monsters of that book franchise is it translates really well into a way where it's not like, oh, it's jumping out at you, but it's like, man, the anticipation of a monster, the anticipation of this story unfolding in a truly terrifying way, it really lands when that is the focus. And I'll get into the cons on when that's not the focus, but when it is the focus, it really works. Like, there are some really scary stories, and maybe it's my bias because y'all know I am not afraid of clowns. Clowns don't scare me. Oh my gosh, I love clowns. But, and I love Pennywise. But what actually really does scare me is scarecrows. And yeah, there's a scarecrow in this, which is why I was like, am I going to sit through this film? I totally did, because I love the adrenaline rush of the fear. And yeah, it delivered. The monsters definitely deliver. And this is a movie that doesn't rely on jump scares. It actually really relies on the folklore, on the mythos, on the urban legends that some of these stories draw from, and creating an atmosphere that draws you in when that is the focus. So kudos for that, because there are truly some horrifying moments in this film. Depth, in the sense of the movie, it takes place around the Vietnam War. And it takes place in a time that was kind of a dark part of our, history. There's a lot of dark parts of our history in the United States, but this is one of those darker parts that doesn't seem like a darker part until, of course, we look at it 2020, looking back on the situation, entering the Vietnam War, the whole question of the corrupt president, Nixon, being elected into office, things of that nature. And I thought this movie, it wasn't overt, but it did a very good job of kind of showing you that, yes, there's these fantastical horror, not so based in reality monsters, but then there are real world monsters that these teenagers, that these humans are also dealing with. And it did I think it really made a bold choice and having that be a backdrop. And I know you see online, because this is the world of the internet, I did see some people kind of like, why pick this time frame? But it totally actually made sense to me, in the sense of, if you don't want it to be too on the nose about real world horror, and making it about 2019, because stuff is so political right now, right? So overtly political. It's kind of hard not to be political right now. And you put it in a different time frame, you can still get that same messaging across. The idea that, yes, as young people, as children, we're afraid of the boogeyman, the thing that goes bump in the night, the monster that's under our bed or in our closet. And yet there's also these real world terrors that we will face as we go into adulthood, and sometimes not even in adulthood. And I think the movie actually did a very good job, in a subtle way, of showing that parallel, of showing that intertwining of real world terror and horror with the fantastical horror of the monsters, of the stories, appealed to audiences of all ages. Now, I'm not exactly saying bring a toddler to the theater. Honestly, I don't want any toddler in theaters most of the time when I go to the theater. But I'm not saying it's like that wide of an audience. But it also, what this movie did a very good job of is making it so that someone like 12 to like 13 plus, in that age range, 12 to 13, I guess, could appreciate it and not be traumatized. But then also, you as an adult, and some of us, like people who sometimes can be so desensitized to so much horror that we're like, oh yeah, that person got beheaded. Sure, seen it before. Oh my gosh, so unimpressed. That we could actually get something out of it. And I think this goes back to what I was saying about the monsters, about how they set up the atmosphere of fear, of the unknown, that was just so raw and so like in your face intense when it came to the monsters, and when it came to connecting that to like a reality. And in that sense, it made it so that you could appreciate it as a horror film. But I think, younger people who may not really be into horror, who haven't seen a lot of horror movies, could watch it, and it's a step above like a Goosebumps film, right? Goosebumps films, it's still scary. I think Goosebumps is a scary franchise. Shout out to R.L. Stine, one of the earliest horror books I used to read. But even in that regard, there's still a certain kind of PG vibe about it. And Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is not PG. Like, people die in this film. And that makes sense, right? Because Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was a book series that kind of pushed the envelope in regards of, yes, this is a book series and stories that are geared towards younger people, but it didn't necessarily like skim on the fright or the terror or the ominous kind of stories within it and monsters, right? And so I think there's something to be said for that. So I like that the movie didn't like kitty it. That's not really a phrase or a word, but I think you get what I'm saying, right? Generic characters. I don't know if this is because we've just had such an influx in the last, 2 to 3 years of plots and movies and series where it's like a group of young kids and they're fighting some type of evil, right? We've had an influx of very similar kind of movies and stuff. I mean, it Chapter 1 kind of reminds you of that. Stranger Things kind of reminds you of that. And not saying both of those are, I mean, I don't watch Stranger Things, but it Chapter 1 was solid, right? So I'm not like ragging on that. But I think because we've seen an influx of that, and there's, of course, there's some that I'm missing, that maybe I'm a little jaded of it, or maybe just some of those characters stood out so well that when seeing it in this movie, how some of those characters didn't actually stand out, it was more glaring. Maybe that was it. Because the thing is, a lot of these characters fit the archetype of characters. You had the pretty girl who was kind of vapid. You had the smart girl who had some issues in family life, but she was smart. You had the cute new boy. You had the jerk popular jock guy. You had the class clown. You had the smart straight guy type thing. All of them fit the type. And I'm not saying that you don't need those types, because they make sense storyline wise. Usually you have those types. But I think we have gotten to a point where you've seen stories that use the types, but turn them on their head or make them unique enough that you don't even actually notice that they're like fitting a generic kind of part that's needed for a plot, for a story. And I think Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark didn't do that as well as it could have. They were kind of bland a little bit. Plotting. So, like I mentioned before, I appreciated some of the very bold choices they took in the structure and framework of this film, placing it with the backdrop of the Vietnam War, around the Nixon campaign, some of the monsters that they chose to really drive home. So many great and bold choices that really were highlights of the film. Yet, where the film suffered was when those things were kind of pushed to the side for the generic storytelling. This kind of goes back to the whole thing of the characters and in the way they tried to connect all the stories. And it was a plot, the way they tried to connect it was a plot that we've seen before. And because the characters didn't stand out and because of the way they were doing it, it was kind of like, oh man, it's kind of a missed opportunity the way that they're trying to connect all of this, because they probably could have done a better job. I just think the plotting, when you had the moments where they focused on the monsters and the stories and even some of the real world horrors, it sparked. It made sense. And then there were moments where we had to wait in between that to get to the next point of those great highlights. And that's when the story lagged. That's when I lost interest here and there. Also, there were plot holes. There were plot holes. And I think, like I said, it came from because they were trying to work to use an overarching plot to connect all the mini stories. I think they forgot some stuff or something in some of the details towards the end of how certain things would be plausible. And so it just didn't feel complete in that regard. And I was like, what? And then there was seemingly a setup for a sequel, and I'm not even sure how. In what regard could there be a sequel with the same characters from this movie? Child abuse. There is a trigger warning of child abuse in this film. Not explicitly showed necessarily, but very much hinted at and referred to a lot. Yes, scary stories to tell in the dark is Twisted approved. I think the monsters and the scary stories that they did adapt really were terrifying and made for some great horror moments. I even think the real world commentary was awesome, so you'll get a little bit more depth out of it. I just think that the plotting was a bit uneven and some of those characters were super generic. But other than that, I think it will be a haunting time at the movies. Okay, y'all, so that is what I thought of scary stories to tell in the dark. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you agree with my pros and cons? Do you disagree? Did you like the movie? Do you dislike the movie? Let me know, comment down below. What stories in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, if you've read the book series, do you think they should have shown, or you had hoped that they would show that they didn't? Let me know, comment down below, and also be sure to subscribe so that you're the first to know when I post my videos. Thanks for watching, y'all.